Okay, brilliant. Well, welcome back, everybody, and welcome back to everybody in the virtual community as well. So a quick technical point for the virtual group. We've noted the sound questions. We have made a small twitch and tweak. Do let us know if that creates any issues for anybody else, because that can be reversed in that case. But otherwise, we hope that this tweak will make it a better experience for some of the people that were having issues. On top of that, we've got Angel Hoover, who is now wearing a lapel mic, so hopefully that will also make life a little bit easier for our speaker. Sorry, Mark and Drea, but we'll try and make that change for the rest of the speakers as well. So welcome back, everybody, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Angel today, a colleague and friend of mine. Angel is a managing director at Willis Towers Watson and head of our Benelux office. But before that, she was also in her previous life at Willis Towers Watson, an avid talent and reward specialist focused on leadership. I know Angel as being extremely passionate about her job, and I'm pretty sure you will get that once you start to hear her speak shortly. And I've worked with Angel on various projects, and I know Angel has worked with a lot of organizations and a lot of leaders looking at how to deal with the people and business risks that they have to go through in an M&A, and she'll be sharing some of those insights with us today. I think what is key in Angel's message is it's going to start with leaders and leadership, and that's really, really important. And in order to make sure that this is going to be a clear and interactive presentation, I know Angel's also included a couple of case studies and some practical tips. What can you actually do? Because I do realize that for a lot of people, maybe it sometimes sounds a little fluffy, or as Drea just said, the softer side, but actually hard. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Angel and to talk to us about leadership.
I'm really excited to talk about this topic because, as Gabe said, I'm pretty passionate about it, and I've spent the past 25 years in one way or another working on projects in this space and starting to understand what the role that leaders either need to play or the role that they are playing and the role that we want to encourage them to play really is. And in addition to doing this work with clients over that period of time, I've also had some recent experience of my own in my own internal organizations to do just that. We are going to hopefully be slide light and discussion heavy for today, very much like the presentation that Mark and Drea just took you through. But where I'll start with is a few slides around why are we talking about this topic? Why is it important that we discuss the role of leaders in M&A, which is a time that's certainly rife with uncertainty and ambiguity, which is something that we have certainly experienced a lot of over the last 18, 20 months as we've gone through our global pandemic. So it's put us in a little bit of a different mindset about how we look at leaders and the role they play in sort of our day-to-day life, as well as in the work that we do in the transaction space. And the roles and behaviors that we need from leaders, as I said, is not always the roles and behaviors that we get in times of uncertainty and ambiguity. They're humans too. And I want to talk a little bit about what our expectations are and some research that we've done that tells us what those fundamental characteristics are that really help to be a catalyst for successful integration and transaction work. Then I want to talk about another case study where we talk about leadership fit. So this is a conversation we've certainly had a lot of, but when we're in the deal phase of due diligence, we're starting that process, a little like what Drea said, where she's early on, we start to talk about whether there is a deal that we want to do. We worked with a private equity to identify how do you start to do that assessment when you can't really do a formal assessment. And we figured out a really neat way to do that I hope gives you some ideas on how you might start to assess whether the leaders and the leadership team will be a good fit for whatever deal you're trying to do. And then just some practical learnings through not only my own experience over the last 18 months, which has been much more personal, but over the course of the work that we've done over the last few decades. So first of all, just wanted to talk about why are we talking about this? And I think first of all, it's important to know that there's a lot of research out there that has talked about how important leaders and leadership is to the success of a deal. And particularly in times of uncertainty and ambiguity like we've discussed here. But what we're missing is what's the profile? What do we expect leaders to do? Why is it we think that they're so important, but yet we haven't said, here are like the fundamental things we need them to do or do differently? Now, there are some things that we do in a deal that we do pretty well. So first of all, we do a great job of selecting the top of the house, right? We get our N-1, often we get our N-2 in place. But what I have experienced, and certainly what we've experienced at WTW, is that not all of the organizations that we work with, and even this was true for ourselves, we didn't optimally set our leaders up to really deliver on some of the human aspects of bringing the team along. Even those people that we put into those leadership roles, we didn't equip them very well. We said, okay, now you're a leader, now go be a leader, right? But we kind of left them alone and expected them to do what they needed to do to help really bring the deal to close. And then we also forget about those people who weren't necessarily selected. In the case of a merger, as an example, there's a whole cadre of people that we've forgotten to also equip. And we didn't tell them what we needed from them. And then also, as we go through the discussion today, I'm not just talking about leaders in that very formal top of the hierarchy. I'm talking about the leaders who are informal leaders and influencers inside of the organization, which, by the way, have enormous influence on the people that are in the middle of the organization, right? These are people that we see that have a 360-degree view and impact on the people that are around them. They can be a huge asset for intelligence gathering and two-way feedback. So we're going to talk about that as well. So that's really why we talk about this. And as I said, the last 18 months has really put an exclamation point on the importance of leadership during times of uncertainty and ambiguity, which, corporate transactions are rife with that. I think, Mark, you said they're predictable in their unpredictability, right? And we know that every deal is a little bit different, but we know that we have to manage the people aspects of this. So because there wasn't a good definition, there wasn't a good profile that research and white papers out in the world had provided for us, we said, you know what, let's look at what matters most to employees in times of uncertainty and ambiguity. What's really driving engagement during these periods where people are absolutely disrupted? So we did some statistical modeling on 10 global organizations who were undergoing significant, what we would consider to be, big T transformational change. And what we found with complete consistency was that leadership was either number one or number two in driving employee engagement during times of ambiguity and uncertainty. So across these industries that you see here, it was absolute consistency. So it's not that the other things don't matter, but these were statistically predicting that employees would remain engaged. And by the way, that leads to people staying rather than deciding to leave the organization when you have all of this disruption. So clearly, we've got some statistical evidence that says, okay, we need to do this right. But once we know that that's the case, what do we actually ask them to do? So many of you have probably seen some version of the change curve. So I'm showing one here, and many of you probably also know that the original curve was designed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in the 1960s, and there's William Bridges has one. They all have a variety of what you see on this page. And the important thing to know is that leaders have the ability to affect the amount of time that individuals spend in any of the quadrants that you see here, which is the natural human reaction to change. We are absolutely neurologically hardwired to respond to change in the same way. And whether that's a positive change, so think about maybe when you got married to your spouse or you bought your first car, really exciting changes. There's this moment of excitement, but then there's a, ooh, there is a lot that I have to deal with. I'm giving up my time. I've decided that I won't have as much discretionary income. So there's these quadrants that we have to move through, which impact the level of productivity that we have in other parts of our life. In this instance, it's about how much productivity I am losing as a result of the disruption caused by the uncertainty and ambiguity of life around me. So these quadrants, denial to resistance, is a natural way we work through until we get to the time where I start to see in exploration, okay, maybe there's a positive side to this. How someone needs to tell me what's in it for me. How do I start to move myself through that quadrant and up to where we call commitment or institutionalization, where I am fully on board with what you are asking me to do differently than I did before. And although this line looks a little bit linear, it's a single line, it's important to know that I may find out something when I've moved into exploration, which gives me new evidence, which sends me all the way back to denial again. So it doesn't work quite as linearly as it suggests here, but it's important as leaders to understand that we move through this change like this. So what do we tell people to do? Once we understand and we can educate leaders that this is the natural process that they go through, what do we tell them to do? How do we equip leaders, as I said in the very beginning, to do something about this and reduce the amount of productivity losses that we see and shorten the amount of time it takes for us to get from resistance all the way up to commitment? Well, I affectionately call this middle section that you see here the valley of despair. There are people in this room who have heard me say that. And as a leader, and as we are educating and equipping our leaders, what we want to do is help them figure out how to shorten that time frame that our people spend in the valley of despair. And there are a number of things that we can get people to do and leaders to do, again, regardless of hierarchy, in each of these quadrants. So if our people are initially in the denial phase, that big purple quadrant that you see on the upper left-hand corner, it's all about frequent and consistent messaging. Now, at the beginning of a deal, we also have to remember that your leaders, they sometimes forget that they've been onboarded earlier in the process. So they've had time to work through, that change curve. And they think that the first time they go out and talk to their employee population or the segment that they're responsible for bringing along on the change, this is the first time they've heard it. And they have wonderfully forgotten how they reacted the first time they heard about this. So that's way behind them. So we need to make sure that as they go out, they're also prepared to deal with, the shock, the anger, the resistance that we saw on the first page, which is the reactions, the very natural reactions that we get from people. So it's about making sure that we are equipping them with messages. At this stage, we may not have answers about what the destination is, right? We may not have answers about what the organization is going to look like, but we do typically have answers about what the timeline looks like. What's the process look like? In the absence of answers about what my organization will be, sometimes with separation, we may not even know the name of the new company yet. It's called NewCo, right? Something very exotic like that. We want to make sure that we are giving them information about the process at that point. We also want to be taking advantage of the grapevine. So the grapevine is a wonderful communication channel, but usually that is controlling us rather than us controlling it. So we want to make sure that we are equipping leaders to go out and manage those messages and address those rumors really quickly before they start to create more negative resistance in the organization. As we move into the resistance area, this is where you also need to start engaging people, maybe not in the deal itself, but in the process of implementation, or at least in providing input and feedback so we know what the concerns are of the impacted employee population. Making sure that we are acknowledging and legitimizing reactions. Some of our leaders will say, oh, you don't have anything to worry about. That is the worst thing that they could say, because essentially they're saying that isn't a legitimate way for you to feel, and you shouldn't feel that way. And that will disengage that employee population quicker than it takes him or her to say that. So making sure that you are equipping them to really acknowledge that and listen very actively. These sound like really simple things, but sometimes leaders feel like they have to have the answer, and we don't need them to have the answer. Sometimes we need them to use the 2 ears and 1 mouth that they have rather than the reverse. So some of that is the message that we have to give to our leaders. And then as they start to look up and see, okay, I'm starting to see the light at the end of this tunnel. It's about equipping those leaders to translate for the employee population what this means for them and what the benefits might be. And there should be benefits that they can acknowledge. But remember that often employees are also doing 2 roles, right? They are doing the day job, and then they're working on the transition, whatever that transition is taking them to, whether it's a merged company, a separated company. They're doing 2 jobs, and acknowledging that as a leader in an authentic way is really important to help them make that last leap into what we call commitment or institutionalization. And as we move into that, we want to be able to sustain that change through, KPIs that are rewarding the behaviors that we need from people for the organization to be a strong, sustained, and viable company, whatever that one might be, and giving really frequent feedback on the process. So those are some things that we can do at each stage of that change curve. We also did another study where we asked M&A integration executives, what do the most successful integration leaders do? And it was really clear that there were 4 fundamental characteristics that strong integration leaders and roles that they play when they are managing these transactions. So those are the 4 that you see here: inspirers, crisis handlers, change agents, and growth seekers. Inspirers are those people who are really good at creating that vision, painting that picture for the employee population who's being affected, but also setting a very clear direction on how to walk that path, right? So it's not just about this big visionary approach, it's also about how do I do that and making that an achievable goal for the people in the organization to really be able to wrap their arms around. The second one is crisis handlers, and again, predictable in its unpredictability. We never know, and never can anticipate, the things that will go wrong or get in the way of the deal. And your crisis handlers are absolutely imperative in a transaction, because they are the ones who very calmly, very resiliently, with gravitas and poise say, "It's okay. This is how we're going to handle it." And you have all of those people on your deal teams that are so good at that, even though inside they're probably like, uh-oh, like how are we going to manage this? On the outside, they're absolutely the best problem solvers that you have, and it creates confidence in the organization to be able to move through that deal. Your change agents, I think, in the last 10 years, I think we've gotten so much better than we were, maybe 2 decades ago, of understanding just how important this group is. They are vital to translating what it means for the individual employees within the impacted organization. These folks, again, don't have to be high in the organizational hierarchy, but their level of influence is really critical. And as they do that translation, that team then goes out and also feeds the rest of the organization with the messages you want them to hear, rather than some of the negative messages that you hear in the grapevine. And the growth seekers, these are the ones who are pushing for the change to happen. Whatever that transition is, they're saying this thing has to happen. They're challenging you to push faster, to push farther. They're challenging the status quo as well as leaders in a really vocal way, but in a positive, constructive way that allows the organization to really successfully go through that transaction. And there are a couple of others that were identified as strategic, technically, or intellectually important. And this isn't a surprise. And both Drea and Mark talked a little bit about the coordinators. These are the folks who are putting that roadmap, that program together so that everything works within that roadmap and the key milestones are really achievable. And the persuaders are the ones who are making sure that we're clear about what the benefits are and making sure that that translation that the change agents are doing for all of the employee population is really, that story is consistent. So these are the different roles. Now, those are the positive ones. We also have what we would call those passive and sometimes covert resistors and roles that people play. And there are 3 of them here: the supporters, the regulators, and the overthinkers. And these folks can sometimes be a little bit more challenging to see. It's not always overt. And it's something that we have learned you need to look out for, because if you have them in the organization, it's like a satisfied customer, right? One satisfied customer tells 3 people, one dissatisfied customer tells 10. So just think about these roles as well. If you see someone who, is acting in the way of a supporter or a regulator in particular, make sure that you are neutralizing a possible negative impact that those folks are having on the overall program and transition that you're trying to enact. So I want to talk about the first case study that we did, and this was probably the wildest transformation, integration, separation that I've ever worked on. And the reason for it was, and why I called it the disruption to the power of 3, because within 3 months, this medical products and biotech organization decided to acquire an organization that was half its size, so 50% of its current size. It decided to transform 2 global functions, their P2P and their R&D function. and it decided to separate at the same time. So that's a lot of change all at one time. And as we just kept getting indications that we were going to move from one thing to the next, it was enterprise-wide. So these were not just, I'm only affecting like this small group over here. They were global implications for each one of those. And what we understood was that this was uncertainty, ambiguity. Because we were doing all of this at one time, there were some really clear things that we had to do really quickly in order to start understanding how to manage some of the disruption that we were experiencing. So we definitely did not have answers, but we knew that we needed to equip people and leaders. So the first thing that we did was put together an integrated communication and change management strategy. We were part of, the global, program management office and the transition management office. But we put that together, did it for each of the 3 separate streams that were happening, and then looked at what the audience impacts were. We also activated a really robust talent engagement and management plan. Some of the things that we were doing, you can see on the right-hand side of this page, and I'm happy to go into detail after this. We had to activate a global change management network because so much change required us to understand how people were feeling about all of the different changes that could have impacted them. And there were people in the organization that were going to be impacted by all 3 things at one time. And we knew that it was really important and imperative, as Mark Andrea talked about at the very beginning, that we hold on to those people. Some of them were incredibly critical to the viability of the future separated business. And we needed to be sure that we were kind of wrapping our arms around them. And then we had a regular change management assessment, so a change readiness assessment to help us understand what we needed to provide people in order to really help them manage through such a difficult period. And that gave us that, in addition to a number of other things, gave us the information that we needed to define what our training, what our toolkits were, what the resources were, what resources were going to be required for the leaders to be stood up in a way that helped employees manage through all of that change. And we learned a couple of really important things. So one was over-communicate. Absolutely just keep getting out in front of that team. In the absence of any destination or any final decision, we got overwhelming advice from the change readiness assessment that said, we know you don't know what the final answer is, but keep telling us what the timelines are. Tell us what the process is going to be, so at least we don't feel like we're in a black hole. Right? So this uncertainty, they just said, keep communicating. I don't care if you have to tell me the same thing as you told me last week, keep talking to me. Another thing, because there was so much disruption, we learned that the retention program has to be more than about money. So it has to be less about the dollars, which for some people is important but is short term, and more about what is that overall employee experience that we should be providing to the people. Amplifying our recognition practices, asking for input and feedback on a regular basis. We did that through surveys, we did that through our change agents and the advocates that they activated in each of their businesses. We did that through anonymous different tooling that we'd put in place. So making sure that you're continuing to do all of that. And finally, during a time of disruption like that, it was really important for the organization to set realistic targets and goals. With that much disruption, the idea of business as usual was way out of bounds, right? And it was such a disengager that the organization had to take a step back and say, okay, we hear you. We're going to reset what our expectations are. They aren't going to go down much, but we're going to have a different expectation for this period. Okay, so as we think about the kinds of leaders that you need and how you select leaders to play the kinds of roles that we just talked about in that case study, that's a big ask, right? And typically the easier part of that ask is aligning leadership capabilities to the strategy that you have as a business. We're pretty good at that, right? We know how to do that really well. But we also know that a leader who is leading a growth strategy is different from the type of leader who is managing a transaction strategy, which is, more around the lines of operational efficiency, cost control, managing risk, that sort of thing. So these are different types of leaders. But what we've learned is that's only one part of the equation. As we've been talking through this, we got that part right. The harder part is making sure that we get the right-hand side of this seesaw also under consideration. So the softer side of the capabilities where we have leaders who can engage with our population really effectively. And we went through a project recently with a private equity. And this is why I say, so pre-close in the due diligence or pre-due diligence phase when you're starting to look at an organization. So the challenge here for this private equity was that they had made a couple of investments with organizations who on paper looked brilliant, right? The financials looked good, the market looked good, the opportunity was there. But they had a materially different result than they expected to. And they started to think about why that was, and they realized that the subjective assessment they had done of those leaders was different across the different investment managers. And they said, okay, well, maybe we need to figure that out, right? Maybe we need to see what it is, what kind of impact this is really having on our investment strategy. So that's where we started with I've got to understand how to assess leaders for fit when I can't put them through a psychometric, I can't send them through a Russell Reynolds assessment. I need to figure out a way to do this. So what we did was we went through a process talking to each of them, and we realized that they had some very consistent core ideas of the expectations they had of leaders. And that also aligned quite well with our predictive model for potential and performance. And so we developed an evaluation that multiple leaders could use in that due diligence process in any kind of a setting. So we had, the explanation of what the core characteristics are that they felt were really important to a successful investment from their perspective, and many of them had 30 and 40 years of investment experience. So we felt pretty good about the data that we were gathering, and we knew that they were going to use it in different settings. So an hour lunch here where maybe they could squeeze in a few questions, a leadership team meeting here, and assessing all of that, but then allowing them to dynamically, in groups, submit their information and the results of their own personal assessment into the same tool so that a report could be produced at the end that then got collated into the overall due diligence assessment that they did. And this has been also a great tool to help develop their next generation leaders, because now it's really clear to that next level of upcoming investment managers what to look for when they're not only assessing the hard numbers, the market, but they're also looking at what do you need to have in a leader and a leadership team for a successful deal. So don't underestimate fit. So just maybe one more thing that I wanted to share around, what we see leaders focusing on, especially when you're comparing it to successful versus not as successful deals, or very successful versus not as successful deals. And what you see here is not a surprise given where we started this conversation. Influencing the effectiveness of senior leadership has a 27-point difference between very successful deals and not as successful deals. Effectively and openly communicating throughout the transition, even in the absence of final decisions. Employees want to hear something, they want to hear where you are, and creating and implementing strategies to retain key employees that go beyond just the dollars and cents that we want to give to employees. So, I think there are really a couple of other things that I wanted to leave you with before we move into questions. And, first of all, I think it is about assessing and selecting leaders that not only fit with your strategy, but are able to connect to the human side of the population that is being impacted, and even those that are just outside or adjacent to the population is impacted, because there's also a grieving process that leaders need to acknowledge for those folks as well. Sign them up, right? Once you get them identified, sign those people up and activate them in the organization. Once you select them, that's not job done, right? Don't let them just go off and start designing their organizational strategy and their operating model. Get them engaged and get them out in front of the team so they can bring people along on that journey, regardless of which role they're going to play, whether they're an inspirer or a change agent or a growth seeker. Really get them engaged. The other thing, we learned, particularly in the very first case study, is that you need to equip leaders to give your key talent what I call the bear hug. Wrap your arms around those people. I had a leader who was completely surprised when her heir apparent left the organization. And I just said, "Did she know?" And she just looked at me like, "Uh-oh. That was probably an easy thing that I forgot to do." So make sure that you're equipping them to give them a bear hug. Have those conversations. Over-inform and over-communicate. What we have learned also in organizations like the med products and biotech organization that I talked about, we have technical leaders who are not comfortable saying, "I don't know." And in a time like I have described and what we often live through in transactions, there is a period of time where there's lots of, "I don't know the answers yet." And there is a way that we have to educate and get them really comfortable with saying, I don't know the answer, but I'll get it. And also equipping them to recognize resistance in their organizations so they can, at minimum, neutralize that. Right? We don't want those negative Nellies to be spreading those negative messages. So getting leaders to understand it, recognize it, and then do something about it. And then finally, don't underestimate the value of retention strategies that go beyond the dollars. It is really about that holistic experience. Even if the pay is there, people are starting to look at the other things that they have within the organization that keep them there. Make sure you remind them of that. And then really make sure you reward the behaviors that you need to see in that new organization. And finally, in the sustain phase, it's the leaders that you need in the stabilize phase may not be the leaders that you need in the sustain phase. So make sure you go through that process again once you're in that final phase, either of the deal or of the organization's life. Okay. Questions?
Aaron Orbson. So the question relates to situations with say, post-acquisition, where there is, chronic change at the top level and at the second level.
Yeah.
And does that kind of damage the business? If I reflect, I can think of 3 stories in my own journey, but one of them, we'll say, was private equity taking over a public listed company, and it was a multi-billion euro deal.
Yeah.
And they cleared out basically all operations, all supply chain, all commercial. They left in the regulatory roles, legal, HR, regulatory, quality.
Okay.
But even, we'll say, 2 years later, the people that they brought in, they had another round of change.
Yeah.
Now, if I look at the EBITDA outcomes, it's a success.
Yeah.
And probably the people who are down weren't as stressed as they could have been, but the people at the top level, it was hugely dynamic. Do you think that's bad for a change, or is it okay and normal?
Oh yeah, I mean it's a good question. I think there's a couple of things that I would want to know. I think first of all, was that deal clear when they came in, right? When you have a private equity involved, that clearly it sends a different kind of a message, right? Because the expectations of PE is different than if you're merging with another corporate. And I would say that it's probably not a super comfortable position, but if the deal that's in place has clarity around this is your job over the next 2 years, and then you know what? Once that job is done, not sure what happens after that. So if that clarity is there, then I think it's okay, right? Especially if it's contributing to a successful organization. But I don't think that if you were trying to attract someone into the organization, it would be a tougher sell, right? To say, yeah, come join us, unless the deal is really clearly the deal that we're offering is clearly covering all of that, saying, yep, this is a 2-year gig, and then you're out. I think in those instances, that honesty, that authenticity about what you're trying to achieve and the time frame that you're trying to achieve it isn't necessarily a bad thing. And that's also going to be attractive to a certain kind of leader and a certain kind of professional, right? But there are, and as we talked about, like that is a certain kind of strategy. And there are leaders that is the thing that they do, right? And you hire them for those purposes. So I don't think it's good or bad, but my suggestion is if you're honest about it, then you're going to get the right people in those roles. If you get someone who is not fit for that kind of a role, that is going to be a disaster, because if you have an expectation of someone who's trying to make a career out of that move, then that may not be it, right? It would be a skill development opportunity rather than, this is the next phase of my career. That's what I would suggest, but I have a feeling there are people in the room who also have an opinion about this, so we'll talk about that at the break. Really good question.
All right, we have a couple of questions from the virtual community. So first of all, from Peter Dick of Dynamic, communication is very important. Who is in charge?
Who is in charge? Oh, that's a great question. Well, I will tell you, in most instances where I am working a deal, there is a collective that's in charge. It isn't a single individual. It's typically we have a work stream in whether it's the program management office or the transformation management office, and there is that group plans based on the input and the feedback that you're getting from the organization, and that should come from all levels, right? It should come from the impacted employees, it should come from your change agents, it should come from your leadership, and it should come from the leaders and the steerco of your program management office. So it isn't one person typically, especially in bigger deals, but we should be collectively agreeing on what those communication messages should be as a full team, but taking into account the information, the data that we've gathered from the organization, so that the messages are on point and are addressing the right concerns at the right time. So Individual responsibility, at the end of the day, I would say still, you have a steerco, you have an executive committee that is signing off on what the transformation or program management office is doing, and we're, typically making sure that everyone's on the same page about that. Because in a deal situation, there's too many stakeholders. I would say it's tough for one person to have the holistic view that I think you would need.
Great. Thanks very much, Angel. In the interest of time and making sure that everybody gets enough time to do the networking, which I know everybody is really interested in, thank you very much. That was really interesting. I'm sure everybody can use some of these practical tips to work on their next deal. And please, for the virtual group, do stick around on the tables in the virtual community. And for the live and in-person group, can I invite you to another cup of coffee and to chat to each other?
Yep, thank you.
Big round of applause for Angel.
Thanks. Thanks.
We encourage you to, when you're in the lounge, click on a chair, join a table. You can have a private discussion with other virtual attendees. You can send each other private messages and talk to each other in those little tables. So we'll see you back in 25 minutes. Thank you.